All right, cool. All right, everyone, thanks for coming out today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Adam Welz. Adam is based in South Africa, where he's a writer, conservation consultant, photographer, and movie director. He's written pieces on wildlife conservation and climate change that have appeared in a number of popular publications such as The Guardian, The Atlantic, Time Magazine. And in 2023, Bloomsbury Press published his book, The End of Eden, Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown, which is receiving very high praise from a number of sources. For instance, Pulitzer Prize winning author Elizabeth Kolbert, author of The Sixth Extinction, says, "The End of Eden is at once an elegy and an exhortation, a plea to save what's left of Earth's magnificent diversity." Today, Adam will share more about his work, which connects us to nature and brings us right into the middle of the sixth extinction that we're undergoing and galvanizes us to act and preserve what remains of the diversity surrounding us. Please welcome Adam Welz.
Thank you very much, and thanks all of you for taking some time to be here. It's really is great to be in the city, especially at this time of year, with all the migrant birds coming through. I'm a bit of a birder. I have been a bit of a birder since I was about 10 years old. I'm also an all-around kind of old-fashioned naturalist. I like bumbling around in places and bumping into different species and figuring out their names and how they fit into things. I'm not nearly as academically as accomplished as any of you in this room. But I see my role as a kind of a go-between, between the academic world, between the scientific world, between practical conservationists and what we might like to call regular people. Spent most of my life working in the media. I've done a whole bunch of other things as well in a whole bunch of different countries. I've lived in the US for quite a few years, mostly in New York City, but also in places like Alaska and California. Currently back in the country of my birth, South Africa, mega diverse, mega complicated, mega interesting country. A lot of my work is trying to answer the simple question, how do we save species from extinction? And I look at it from all kinds of different angles. I look at it from the financial angle, how do we fund this work? I look at it from the moral angle. How do we make a moral case for conserving species? I look at it from cultural angles. I look at it from a linguistic angle. How do we talk about conservation? How do we talk about species? How do we talk about nature? And very much interested in this new era that we're moving into, because climate change, or climate breakdown, as I prefer to call it, has totally changed conservation. It's made the aims of conservation as they came to be understood through the 20th century impossible to achieve. And a lot of nature conservationists haven't yet fully comprehended this. And if they've actually comprehended this, they don't really know what to do about it. And that's a very, very interesting thing that we can talk about later. Today, I'm primarily going to be talking about the book that I recently published, as you can see on the screen. It's called The End of Eden, Wild Nature in the Age of Climate Breakdown. And it does, as we say, exactly what it says on the box. The aim of this book is to introduce people to wild species as they try to cope with what's happening in the world of climate. The book is aimed at a general audience. You do not have to have a PhD in anything or even a bachelor's degree to understand things. The way that I approached it is to really start with species, start small, start with intimate stories about species and bring that in to a bigger picture kind of outlook on things. Put in some science, tell people how we know what is happening to these species, and then bring it into a bigger context. Because what I realized is that, first of all, in the media in general, just about everything you see to do with climate change or climate breakdown, as I said, has to do with Homo sapiens. So what does it mean for us? What does it mean for our societies, our economies, and so on? Occasionally, you'll see stories about wild species. And those stories, I noticed, tended to fall into two general types. The one type was a very big and sort of almost abstract kind of story that involved big numbers and something happening in the future. And those kinds of stories were, for example, scientists at XYZ prestigious institution have crunched a whole bunch of numbers, and they've decided that by the year 2038, 47.5% of the trees in Southern Europe are going to be extinct because of climate change. I mean, I'm making those numbers in that story up, but you get the point. Some big percentage of some group of species is going to be in serious trouble by some future date. And when your average reader sees a story like that, they get a bit hopeless and they feel kind of sad because it all feels kind of big and kind of overwhelming. And these fancy scientists have said this, and they don't really know what to do with that information, except sort of feel sad and overwhelmed. And the other type of story I saw was a very completely opposite, a very tiny story. You'd see a story, I joke, it's often about a butterfly in California, because it seems like a heck of a lot of people are studying butterflies in California and how they're responding to climate change. But you'll see a story that says the lesser spotted flippy flappy butterfly from California its range has been reduced to 3% of what it used to be because of global heating, and this tiny little butterfly will be extinct by the year 2034. Again, the average reader looks at this story and thinks, gosh, well, I've never seen a lesser spotted flippy flappy. I've never been to California. Why should I care about this insect? And that sounds terribly sad. And what am I going to do about it? I just feel hopeless. And so the whole point of this book was to try and bridge the gap between those stories, to bridge the gap between the little stories and the big stories by building narratives that start small, that are quite intimate, that are quite around a particular species. And then, like I said, talking about a bit of the science, how do we know what we know, what's happening to the species, and then a little bit of a bigger picture thing so that you can read a story in my book about a particular bird, for example, undergoing something, and you can understand how that process happens. Not just that it is going to happen in the context of these numbers or these future dates, but how that actually happens. So this book is actually kind of ecology 101 or biology 101 hidden in the narrative here. And you can walk off and say, oh, now that I understand how this species in this particular place is experiencing climate breakdown, I can understand that another species somewhere else is undergoing exactly the same thing. So I can have information that I can apply to a whole bunch of different contexts through these stories. And I thought I'd just tell you quickly some of the stories in the book. I'll start off with this rather magnificent bird, southern yellow-billed hornbill. It's a very common species in a lot of the savannas in southern Africa. It's a very characterful bird. I've seen thousands of them in my life. They're fantastically charismatic. They're very active. They're very curious. If you have a picnic in the bush, they'll probably come along and steal part of your picnic if you're not too careful. They take the windshield wipers, the rubber of the windshield wipers of people's cars. They sometimes smash people's windows when they start fighting their own reflection in the window. They're very engaging, fantastic kind of mid-sized hornbill. Now, there's been some really amazing science done, mostly through the University of Cape Town, where I live, looking at these birds in an area of central southern Africa we call the Kalahari, or the Kalahari, if you want to speak the local dialect. It's a very, I would call it an arid savanna. Some people call it a desert, but it's not quite a desert. And these birds are quite common in this area. They nest in hollows and camel thorn trees. They have a really interesting breeding process where the female gets plastered into a hollow in the tree. The pair actually build a kind of wall of their feces that hardens into a kind of a concrete-like thing to wall her into a cavity in a camel thorn tree. They leave a little slit in the middle of the camel thorn, in the middle of this wall, so that the male can run around and catch things like this lizards you see he's carrying a skink with him here, lizards, insects, small mammals, and so on. And while she's imprisoned in this nest, she lays her eggs. She actually undergoes a full molt, so she's flightless for a while, but this wall that is constructed actually protects her from predators. She undergoes a full molt, and then the babies hatch. Then she breaks out of the nest, and they reform, they rebuild the feces wall, the little concrete wall, so that the babies can be protected from predators, and the male and female then feed the babies through the slit, and then eventually they break them out and so on. But what's fascinating about these birds is that they are disappearing from the Kalahari. Their breeding success is collapsing at an extraordinary rate. They were probably breeding pretty well about 20 years ago. Now we're on the verge where, according to the research, from 2027 onwards, just 3 years from now, they will probably experience a 100% breeding failure within the Kalahari region. And the reason for this is quite interesting. It's also kind of simple. It's that daytime temperatures, midday temperatures, are going up in the summer, which is when they breed because of climate change. But it's not that their temperatures are going up so much that there's a massive heat wave and it's just killing thousands of birds and it's a massacre. You don't walk around in the Kalahari and see loads of dead hornbills and what have you lying around. These birds are failing to breed because they're running out of time. And by running out of time, I mean their schedules are being messed up. Because in the hottest parts of the day, these birds survive periods of intense heat through a very sophisticated behavioral mechanism I call sitting in the shade and doing nothing. Basically, what happens is when the ambient temperature gets close to their body temperature or higher than their body temperature, they find a patch of shade underneath a bush. To get out of obviously the radiant energy from the sun, they droop their wings a little bit. They don't move because they don't want to be generating any internal thermal energy by moving their muscles. And they pant because, of course, they're being birds. They don't have sweat glands. They can only offload, energy with water vapor through their mouths. The problem is now, instead of, say, that very hot part of the day being 45 minutes or an hour where they have to sit in the shade and doing nothing, it might be 3, 4, or 5 hours. And now suddenly the birds do not have enough time in their day to go and find the lizards, the mice, and the insects that they need to keep their babies healthy with. And so a large proportion of yellow-billed hornbill babies are simply starving in the nest, and the ones that do make it out of the nest are usually so poorly nourished that they don't last more than a couple of months out in the big wide world. So the adults are doing fine. The adults can make it through these hot periods. They just can't produce any more babies. And in the wild, these birds can live 10 years, in captivity 20 years. So we fully expect within the next 10, 15 years to see yellow-billed hornbills vanish from the Kalahari region, where until now they've been very, very common. And as I say in my book, what's really fascinating is the same thing is happening in arid areas around the world, including the Mojave Desert, which I visited in late 2019, where some fantastic work that was done through folks at UC Berkeley has shown that there's been a catastrophic collapse of the breeding bird community in this area over the last century or so, where almost half of the species that were breeding in the Mojave in the 1920s, 1930s are no longer breeding there, probably for very much the same reason. And it was kind of amazing to me to be in the Mojave, because when I walked around there in September 2019, it seemed like an amazingly vibrant, desert area. These are photos that I took, just within an hour on one morning. There was loads of birds, there were coyotes, there were jackrabbits and desert cottontails and loads of different lizards and so on. And I wouldn't have realized, to me, it looked like a healthy ecosystem. I wouldn't have realized the sort of catastrophic loss of breeding birds were it not for the work of Joseph Grinnell and some very forward-thinking, ecologists of a century ago, just to sort of underscore the value of science and forward-thinking science in terms of understanding what's going on. Another story that I tell in the book is about the Afro-Siberian red knot. This is a wading bird. If any of you, I know there are some birders in this audience, wading birds, notoriously difficult to identify, little brown things that fly enormous distances, usually on their migrations. This is one of the subspecies of red knot. It breeds in the Taimyr Peninsula in far northern Siberia, up in the Arctic, and most of its population winters on an enormous series of wetlands on the coast of Mauritania, on the Saharan coast of West Africa, on the Atlantic Ocean. This bird flies thousands of miles between these areas. And this is another fascinating story where something quite subtle is shifted. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's having catastrophic impacts on the species. And again, has also been taken a lot of science and a lot of research and a lot of very dedicated field work and analysis, in this case by a group of Dutch scientists that have been looking at this bird for a long time. And basically the story is, like a lot of birds that breed up in the high Arctic, they have to time their breeding very, very carefully because everything is covered in ice. And if you arrive too early on your breeding grounds, there's nothing to eat, you starve and you die. However, if you arrive too late after the ice melt has happened, you have too little time to go through your breeding cycle and get your babies safely to adulthood and flown away before the ice returns in the fall. So these birds have always flown, they fly thousands of miles from West Africa all the way up to Siberia. They've always timed these things very, very quickly. They land. It takes them a day or two for the paired adults, males and females, to find each other, to pair up. They lay a little nest of 4 eggs, a little scrape in the ground. That takes 2 to 3 weeks until they have tiny little precocial babies. As soon as the youngsters hatch, the female, who has been sharing incubation duties with the male until then, she says, "Cheers, I'm off," and she leaves. She starts flying through Europe back to Africa, leaves the male to look after the little babies. He has to thermoregulate them because they're so small. They have to, even though they can find their own food, they're precocial, they have to return to him every now and again and get tucked under his wings and get warmed up. Otherwise, they'll die. He also alerts them to predators like Arctic foxes and so on. Takes them a few weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, to get to the stage where they're big enough to fly. I mean, they grow at an extraordinarily fast rate. As soon as they're large enough to fly, the male also says, "Cheers, guys, I'm leaving." He heads off through Poland and Holland back to West Africa. And the youngsters stick around in the Arctic for as long as they can, just to get a little more protein to bulk themselves up, maybe a week or two before the ice comes in, before they then, with genetic guidance, obviously they don't have any adults to show them the way, they head off to West Africa as well. And this system has worked really well for this bird for tens of thousands of years through ice age, ups and downs, and what have you. But now what's happening is really interesting because of global warming, and of course the Arctic is heating up faster than the global average. The spring snowmelt is coming earlier and earlier every year. But the birds are not arriving earlier and earlier every year, at least not early enough. So what we've seen is in this bird's breeding area since the 1980s, the spring snowmelt, on average, has advanced almost a full month, about 30 days. So now it comes about 30 days earlier than it did in the 1980s. But on average, the birds are only arriving 2 weeks earlier than they did in the 1980s. Now, that might not seem like a problem on the face of it. You're a bird, you come along, at least the ice is gone, this is great, you're not going to die, you're not going to starve. But What researchers have found is that there's a particular group of insects, the crane flies, that are really important for red knot babies. Really important. They've got the best protein in them for development. And crane flies start hatching, their eggs start hatching as soon as spring snowmelt commences up in the Arctic. And in the past, when the birds were arriving at the same time as spring snowmelt was happening, the crane fly population, as I say, they first have to hatch, they have to go through their larval phases until they hit their flying phase. The crane fly population would peak at exactly the same time as red knot babies would hatch. So the hatching, they would basically break out of the egg into a world full of fantastic crane flies. However, now the crane fly population is peaking about 2 weeks before the babies hatch. And it's already dropping by the time hatching comes along. And these birds are becoming slightly malnourished. Not so horrifically malnourished that they die, not usually, but malnourished enough that they're about 20% smaller in terms of body weight than they were in the 1980s, the juveniles, and that their bills, their beaks, are about 10% shorter than they were in the 1980s. Now again, this is not such a big deal if you're up in the Arctic. They can still catch insects. They're still big enough to fly all the way to West Africa. The problem comes when they hit West Africa, because in West Africa, they've always subsisted on tiny little clams. You'll see this little clam that's in the beak of this bird. This photograph was taken in West Africa. Tiny little clams called Loripes clams, that these birds are super specially evolved to find. They have incredible pressure sensing organs in their bills that help them find, when they probe into the mud, to find these Loripes clams. But now that their bills are just a little bit shorter than they used to be, and we're talking a matter of 3 to 4 millimeters on average, they can't quite reach most of the population of Loripes clams under the mud. And so over the period of 6 months to a year, the juvenile birds progressively starve and die in West Africa. They get desperate, they start trying to eat vegetation like eelgrass and so on, but there's not enough protein in it and they die. And this bird's population is now in free fall. And it's becoming very heavily female biased, because female red knots are ever so slightly larger than the males. So they have a slightly larger bill and are able to get proportionally more clams than the males. But the forecast now is that this population will be functionally extinct by 2035, just because of a missed appointment with crane flies in the Arctic due to warming. And I tell that story in my book. And I try to get into people's minds by telling this story that ecosystems are not just about species relating in space, as in territories or occupying space. Ecosystems are not just about species relating to each other in food chains or food webs. They're also about species relating to each other in time. And that climate breakdown is messing with a lot of the structure of these relationships in time. Another story that I tell is this rather bizarre and disgusting story about the winter ticks. I don't know if you've heard about this in the northeastern United States. It might be known to some of you in the audience. Essentially what's happening is, again, we're getting the warm season getting longer and longer. The fall is coming later and later. There's much more to the story that you can read in the book. I'm giving you the very short version. But the fall warmth is persisting longer than it used to. And these tiny little winter ticks, these animals, these parasites of moose, are getting a few more weeks to quest and find a host. So moose in the northeastern US and places like Maine are just now experiencing just extraordinary tick loads. And these ticks, I mean, I saw a recent study that said the average moose in Vermont is now carrying 47,000 ticks at the onset of winter. And these ticks are literally exsanguinating these animals. They're taking so much blood out of them that certainly the first year, the juvenile survival rate is now only about 10% per year. Around 90% of juveniles, moose are dying in these areas because they just have no blood left in them. And female reproduction, because these moose, like a lot of parasites, such a drain on the adult females that they can only reproduce at around half the rate that they used to. And so again, we see just a small increase in average temperature, just a slight delay in the onset of winter frosts, you know, which kills these ticks if they are not on a host. You know, causing this huge collapse in the population of the largest mammal in these ecosystems, which of course has interesting and very unknown effects. Anyway, I thought I'd tell you just a little story, another story that I tell in the book about Australia, because I think a lot of the communication of climate change, climate breakdown, especially from a scientific perspective, is often quite devoid of the emotion that's required to really, I think, get through to people what's actually going on out in the world around us. And you know, there's a well-known climate writer in the States, Jeff Goodell. He always says that every writer he knows, anybody who's ever worked on climate has their oh shit moment. And he talks about his oh shit moment looking at the Thwaites Glacier down in Antarctica. I feel like I've had several oh shit moments, actually. And I'll tell you about one of them. I went to Australia, the first time I'd ever been to Australia, while I was writing this book, after their so-called Black Summer bushfires, end of 2019, early 2020. And I deliberately didn't go to Australia while the fires were still raging and occupying the headlines. I very deliberately, I wanted to see the aftermath. And I'd read a bit about Australian ecology. I sort of had an idea, there's quite some parallels with South Africa, kind of understood the deal and how a lot of these ecosystems work. And I drove myself from Brisbane all the way down to Melbourne. I did a multi-thousand-kilometer transect, if you like, of a whole bunch of burned areas. And then I went to a place called Kangaroo Island, which had also been badly burned. But here is a scene of what you would call a typical Australian eucalyptus-dominated savanna, woodland. Kind of a forest, but not quite closed canopy, right? Fairly dry a lot of the year. These eucalyptus trees, of which there are hundreds of species, most of them are fire adapted, like so many of our Southern African species, like, you know, a lot of savanna woodland species around the world. So far, so good. You know, here we are, nice little pieces, some small Australia has just huge numbers of national parks that you've never heard of and that hardly anybody goes to. It's actually amazing because you can have these places all to yourself. Extraordinary place to go nature watching in that respect. This was, I can't even remember the name of this place. Anyway, it was one of these national parks I passed, took some photographs. And then I went to some of these places that had burned. And I was like, holy crap, these places have really burned. I am very familiar with fire-driven ecosystems. I grew up in the so-called high veld of South Africa, which is kind of like our prairie area. It's a grassland system. A lot of those grasslands burn every winter. I've lived in the savannas of Southern Africa, which burn all the time. I now live in the fynbos ecosystems around Cape Town, which are, fire is a very important part of that ecosystem, those dynamics. But I had never seen places that were so thoroughly burned as I saw in Australia. Normally, when a fire passes through a habitat, it leaves these little refugia, these little, maybe, you know, 100 square meters here and there of unburned patch where the lizards and a few of the insects and so on sort of survive the fire and then repopulate the landscape. But my God, there were just none of these things. in huge parts of these burned areas in Australia. And the other thing that struck me is this massive impact of these fires on the aquatic ecosystems. And what I hadn't realized is, like, again, these fires had been so thorough. They had been so hot. They had burned right through. They'd combusted all the organic matter in the top layers of the soil. They turned so much stuff to ash that when the rain came after the fires, and there'd been good rain between the period that the fires had occurred and the time that I'd visited these areas, when the rain came, it just washed just uncountable tons of ash into all the rivers and filled these things up. And of course, the ash is full of nutrients. As soon as it hits the water, it's creating these blooms of various microorganisms, algae, bacteria, what have you, taking all the oxygen out of the water and killing just about everything in these rivers and filling them up, literally. I mean, the pool that this picture is taken at, this was a pool that used to be 8 meters deep. Even the deepest part of the water here now was maybe 50 centimeters. It was absolutely full with just hundreds of tons of ash. And of course, killed off a whole bunch of really rare fish. Quite a few species only survived because a few ichthyologists literally went in there just as the rain started and pulled fish out of the rivers in buckets. They saved, I think 18 species were saved in buckets, would have been wiped out within a matter of days. And it just kind of stunned me, and it made me think about fire, these massive mega fires having these impacts that go well beyond just the landscape that you can, see burn, because of course now all this ash is now making its way down into estuaries. It's totally changing the nutrient profile of the water there. It's being dumped out onto coral reefs, and it's so massive. I mean, I've been speaking to these biologists in the years since, it's almost 5 years now since that happened, and a lot of these streams still look the same. The vegetation was so severely burned that in subsequent years, when they've had hugely, unusually intense rains, it's actually washed a lot of the soil into these rivers. So as the ash is being cleared out, it's been replaced by soil. So again, breeding habitats for fish have just been destroyed pretty much permanently, as far as anybody can tell. Anyway, here's a scene. This was one of my oh shit moments. This is Kosciuszko National Park. It's a well-known national park not too far from Sydney. It's kind of in the Great Snowy Mountains, which is this kind of almost like the fabled Western frontier in the United States. There's a real tough guy, Australian colonists, settled up here. Again, this place was just burned from horizon to horizon. I could see tens of kilometers in every direction, and I couldn't see anything that was unburned. And it'd been like, I don't know, I think 6 weeks since this fire passed through this area. And again, I know eucalypts, they're invasive in South Africa. So it's these trees, I know them really well. They should all be resprouting by now. After fire actually triggers them to resprout. But I spoke to an Australian forest ecologist. He said, yeah, like in a really severe fire in these eucalypts, you sort of tend to see maybe a 20, maybe in really extreme cases, a 30% mortality. Well, I took a walk through these groves and I conducted my own very informal assessment, and I reckon mortality was north of 95%. Less than 5% of these trees were showing any sign of life. It was amazing. I mean, the rocks, any rocks that were in those areas, you see those pictures had shattered from the heat of the fire. Like I say, there was no soil underneath this forest anymore. It was just sand because the organic matter had just been vaporized by the heat of this thing. And the sort of irony of it is a few of these macropods, a few of these wallabies and kangaroos had survived these blazes. I have no idea how anything lived through this. But there was a strip along the roadside that was far enough away from the bulk of the woody biomass, let's put it this way, to where some grass seeds had survived in the soil. And thanks to the rain, these were now sort of sprouting. This was the only place I really found green in the landscape, was along the sides of the roads here. And these few surviving macropods, desperately hungry, had gone to try and eat the grass and, of course, been flattened by cars. And this was my most popular Instagram post ever just for, I said this should be the new poster for Australian tourism. But it was absolutely stunning, and I felt, my gosh, I'm seeing the future. I actually couldn't comprehend the scale and the intensity of what I was seeing. And everything about this landscape was just, it was not how it was supposed to be. And I think that was my sort of one of my oh shit moments in this whole thing. And I think that's something that is actually kind of important, is to go through a point at which I've spent my whole life looking at wild species. I've spent my whole life being a naturalist. I've spent all this time looking at climate change, but I hadn't let the emotional reality of it through until I was in a landscape where the situation was so extreme that my psychological defenses just simply couldn't operate anymore. And it was very difficult, but I think it's also very useful. Anyhow, let me tell you a little bit about Southern Africa. Just a quick thing. Here's a ripped off Google Maps. I live down in this corner here, Cape Town, the southwestern corner of Africa, which is a very, very, very strange place and a really interesting place. It's in the middle of what we call the Cape Floral region. I don't know if any of you have heard of this place. Just has, I mean, we can talk for days about the Cape Floral region. I'll try and keep it down to a few minutes. But it just has it's pretty much the most diverse temperate ecosystem on Earth. You can call it like that. The most diverse temperate habitats on Earth are found here. It's a very, very strange place. Here's Metro Cape Town, roughly, is in this map. We have around 3,000 species of plants native to the metro area of Cape Town. And that is more than some US states have in the entire state, just to give you an idea. But on the face of it, this is a really terrible place to be a plant. The soils, most of them are incredibly old. They've been leached of nearly all of their nutrients. They're essentially like beach sand. It's a fire-driven system. Every 5 to 10 years, most of your average patch of fynbos burns, and everything in it pretty much burns up, except for these little refuges that I mentioned earlier. So every single plant in the fynbos has to have some sort of strategy for surviving fire. And our summers are so dry. We have a climate somewhat similar to the central coast of California. We have wet, rainy winters and hot, dry summers. But our summers are so dry that if you average sort of monthly rainfall during the summer and you took that year round, the city would be classified as a full-scale desert. So if you're a plant in this area, there's hardly any nutrition in the soil. You have to burn down every 5 to 10 years, and you have to get through 6 to 8 months of basically no rain. But yet, we have this mind-blowing diversity in this place. I'll just give you, this is a photograph I took near my house, just to give you an idea of what the fynbos looks like. It's kind of this heathland. There are no trees in it. It's a naturally treeless ecosystem. And a lot of ecologists think that's simply because there's so little of the basic nutrients in the soil that there's not enough nutrient in the soil to actually build a tree out of. The bird you're seeing there is a Cape sugarbird, which is a very weird, archaic species, very strange creature that's kind of emblematic of this area. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out, why is the fynbos region of southwestern Africa, why is it so mega diverse? And one of the reasons is possibly the landscape tends to be very broken. There are a lot of mountains and valleys and so on, which encourage speciation. lots of different sort of altitudes and aspects within quite a small area. Also, the fires force new generations to come into being and sort of speed along, mutation and change within species, obviously. But one of the main reasons that folks think is actually this place has probably been climate stable in terms of having roughly the same sort of annual climate and reliable winter rain for possibly as long as 20 million years, just because of its position on the planet. It hasn't moved around much like some of the other continents and areas have. And also because of the Benguela current, which is a very big cool current that comes from the subantarctic up the west coast of Africa, has moderated the temperature. And it always strikes me when I walk around in the fynbos that this is a product of long-term climate stability. This is what species do. This is what ecosystems do when you put them in a stable climate, even if some of the aspects of that ecosystem on the face of it should not be terribly encouraging to the growth of plants. These are just snapshots I've taken in the veld around my house. The fynbos has the richest geophyte sort of bulb flora in the world. We have critically endangered species left and right. There's species around my tiny little town that have been reduced to total occupation of 2 tennis courts, and are still not protected. 2 of these are critically endangered in this little palette. It's an extraordinary place. And like I say, I just wanted to, underscore, I talk about it in my book as this product of long-term climate stability. But things are changing. I just wanted to say, on the left, we have a bird called a speckled mousebird. On the right is a bird called a red-faced mousebird. They're fairly closely related. What I've noticed just in my area is the speckled mousebird on the left. Until about 3 years ago, I hardly ever saw them. 98% of the mousebirds I saw, the speckled mousebird on the left was the dominant species. They made up, 98% of the mousebirds that I saw in my neighborhood. They have very different calls. These birds are very easy to tell apart, so there's no mixing them up. But in the last 3 years, there's been this bizarre flip, bizarre sort of reversal. And now, nearly all the mousebirds I see in my area are red-faced mousebirds. In fact, I only see speckled mousebirds maybe 2 or 3 times a year now, where daily I have red-faced mousebirds in my area. And generally speaking, the red-faced mousebird is a more arid land species. But it just, again, sort of emphasized to me that you don't have to, what I always tell people is if you start paying attention to the wild species in your area, you don't have to decide whether to believe the scientists or the fossil fuel lobby about whether climate change is real. You will see the changes happening for yourself in your own area. And nothing really has changed about the habitat except we're getting more extreme winter storms. This was our local beach until about a month ago, where it all just washed away in a series of unprecedented storms. We've lost about 8 meters of the frontal dune just in the last 2 years. It's just falling apart. These are, you can see the wooden uprights here. They've been there for 50 years. They're disappearing. And I put in this slide, which is not from South Africa, just to remind me of how to end this talk, and which is something that I really like to emphasize, which is maybe the scariest thing of all about climate breakdown, is that we can spend a lot of time, and a lot of people in this room perhaps spending a lot of time, a lot of energy, their whole careers trying to figure out what's going on in the natural world, trying to understand climate breakdown, trying to understand where we're going. But for me, the sort of intrinsic thing is we're dealing with a mind-blowingly complex system, the biosphere or the global ecosystem, whatever you might want to call it. And we know that when you start throwing spanners into the works of complex systems, they react in unpredictable ways. And so this is a picture I took some 15 years ago in the town of Uncertain, Texas. It's up near the Louisiana border, and I found this turtle crossing the road, and I thought, this really strange little town where nearly everybody seems to have spent some time in prison for some horrific crime, usually murder. It's kind of a very, very, very odd place. Good birds, though. And I think what I'd like to emphasize is that no matter how much we learn or try to understand about climate change, and we as scientists, people have understood quite a lot about it, we can't get away from the fundamental fact that we are moving into an era of elevated uncertainty. And uncertainty is a very, 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 very difficult thing for humans to comprehend and to deal with. Our education systems don't really teach us how to deal with uncertainty. And that's just a little thought that I'd like to leave you with, that actually we're all this turtle trying to figure out where to go in uncertain Texas right now. And the stakes are extraordinarily high. Everything is changing. But maybe if we can tell a few stories, what I'm hoping through this book and so on is will lead more people to really grapple with the scale and the importance of what we're dealing with. All right, you can find me on the socials at these things. Thank you very much. I think we still have a little bit of time for a couple questions. I'm quite happy to be insulted, told that I'm an idiot, that I got it all wrong. I'm pretty robust personality. You can also say nice things too, if you feel like it. Yeah, let's go for it. I think you have a microphone. Fantastic.
Yeah, let's first give a round of applause to Adam. Okay, questions, comments?
I was just wondering if there's any effort to reseed that section of Australia that was affected by the forest fire, or I guess like reintroduce fish stock.
I'm sorry, so could you say that a little more slowly?
I was wondering if there's like an effort to reintroduce fish stock to that area, Australia affected by the wildfire, like maybe reseed it in some.
In Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, there definitely have been some attempts at reintroduction, but a lot of these streams, I mean, I've been in touch with some of these, have been so fundamentally changed. And it seems in quite a long term that some of those reintroduction efforts have failed. And there's now quite a lot of thought and work going on in Australia about putting these species back into river systems that they did not historically occur in, or that there are no records of. So, you know, an assisted, you know, translocation or whatever you want to call it, various different terms for that kind of thing. But yeah, it seems like some of these, to put it in blunt terms, some of these rivers were so severely trashed, so fundamentally changed by those Black Summer bushfires that they are no longer good habitat for the species that used to occur in them, and there's no sign that they will be in the foreseeable future.
Gotcha, thank you.
Hi, yeah. First off, I just want to say your stories were very powerful and very interesting. And I guess my question would be is, how do you choose the stories you want to tell and the species you want to focus on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah, because on the one hand, like everything's changing, right? In the world because of climate change. All of these ecosystems are changing. All these species are being affected. You know, I could tell the story. I mean, there's, like I said to folks, if I really tried to be encyclopedic about this or comprehensive, my book would be 20,000 pages long, and I'd spend the rest of my life writing it, and nobody would ever read it. So yeah, so it was. I just have that kind of spider-like brain where I have a ton of different stories and always reading things, and And I just tried to pick out certain stories which appealed to me, which had a bit of an emotional core, often stories of species in places that I'd personally visited, that I knew at least had had a few days in an area, so I wasn't writing them completely blind, and stories that had some good science behind them, that I could tell was sort of reasonable sort of confidence that there was some good science behind them. And so really that's what it is. But honestly, I could have told orders of magnitude. There are so many species to choose from, honestly. But yeah, so at the end of the day, some of it was literally just a flip of a coin. You know, am I going to write about this lizard or that lizard? Well, you know, because both of them are great stories. Yeah, but yeah, that's it. Is it a species that I know from a place that I've at least been to once in my life, that I could contextualize, I could write the scene? Because I think it's very important for the reader to be able to see in their mind's eye what's going on, you know, get beyond the facts, get into sort of narrative, and is there good science? Is there interesting science behind it? Yeah.
Adam, terrific talk. When I think about this stuff, one of the things I always think about, and you're very well traveled, so the question is along the lines, building on what Zeke was just asking you about, is have you seen places where government structure is remotely adequate for trying to deal with the situation? Are there some good stories out there with respect to that? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see in all this is a lot of governments, particularly in the US, are very poorly set up to deal with biodiversity.
Wow, again, we could have a week's worth of campfires and, you know, many bottles of red wine. In general, no, and not by a long way. We're falling very, very, very short, by orders of magnitude short in terms of effort and people on the ground and what needs to be done. But there are really great examples of giving us, and I'm actually writing a follow-up book to this. This in a way is a problem statement, this book. It's like, this is what's going on. It's a tough book, it's hard, but I think it's very important for people to sit with the problem and try and understand it, because I see a lot of folks, there's this psychological, you know, we want to get away from the psychological pain of what's really going on, right? So we want to move very quickly into solution mode. And so I see a lot of truly terrible solutions being rolled out right now. And one of them that I talk about briefly in the book, but, you know, is a real pet bugbear of mine, is this whole tree planting mania that's going on around the world. Oh, we've got to solve climate change, we've got to plant trees. So there's these governments doing these things where they're trying to plant, you know, 100 million trees in 24 hours, and they're getting all the kids out of the schools, and the army and the military are all planting trees, and everybody, and there's these trillion tree projects, and all the conservation organizations are doing billion tree and trillion tree and raising all this money to plant trees. While in Africa, we're seeing people planting invasive exotic trees, screwing up our native grasslands, moving local people off their land for these tree planting projects. A lot of the tree planting projects are planting the wrong trees, so they all die, which a lot of the time is actually better, because it would be worse if they were growing, drying up water resources, blah, 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 because we all want to move into solution mode. So I think we need to sit with these problems, because they're complex problems, and the solutions to them need to be thought through quite carefully. But I am writing a follow-up book, which is, working title is A Future for Nature. And it tries to revision what nature conservation is about. And as I was saying to some folks before the talk, I believe very strongly that nature conservation needs to be open sourced, by which I mean its methods and its morality needs to be, its moral and conceptual basis needs to be clarified for the era of climate change, because as I said earlier, climate change has completely messed with the sort of moral and conceptual structure of conservation, and very few conservationists have yet acknowledged the depth of that confusion, because again, it's painful if you've spent your whole career working towards a certain goal and now suddenly it's unattainable. But I think we need to reconceptualize conservation. I think we need to make it very possible for quote unquote ordinary people to actually save species themselves, not donate to a conservation organization to go and save the species, let the professionals handle it, because there aren't enough professionals. Even if all the money in the world, professional conservationists are always telling us how their budget needs to be 10 times or 20 times or 100 times bigger. My point is, even if the magic money fairy appeared tomorrow and dropped $100 billion on top of your local conservation organization, they wouldn't know what to do with that money. They wouldn't be able to absorb it. There aren't enough actual humans with the skills and with the impetus to do this work. My thumbsuck is by 2 orders of magnitude. I think we need 100 times more people that are currently engaged in saving species actually doing that. And that means ordinary people doing it in their own spaces, in their own yards, even within their own houses. But they need to understand the conceptual basis of what they're doing. And that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to reconceptualize conservation for the era of climate change with that aim. And so watch this space, is I guess I have to say. Yeah.
I would argue that what you're talking about is actually the need to revitalize and strengthen academic institutions so that they can train the public.
Yes.
To actually go out.
Absolutely.
So in other words, the conservation community is largely a grassroots effort in a lot of situations. And I don't think they're as well as designed or they work as effectively as they could with the academic community in order to build some of the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Absolutely, because a lot of the knowledge that we need is held within the academic community. And again, this is where I see my role as this kind of go-between, between these different worlds. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, that's a great question. Who's up? We're kind of out of time, aren't we? Well, we have one more, if there is one more.
Thank you for your talk. I say just now you showed us many pictures about the fires in Australia.
Yes.
It is really touching. I mean, when I see am I looking at the kangaroo is dying, and I felt really depressed.
Yes.
I just wondering, while you're writing this book, how do you deal with the emotion and the scientific knowledge that you're going to evoke people to care about the ecology and care about the nature and care about how to conserve the ecology to make it to be balanced. So that's my question is, what is your emotion? How do you input your emotion into this book? Thank you.
Well, again, I think in the final chapter of the book, I do write about that, but just to say that a lot of writing this book was really hard, honestly. It was psychologically devastating. There were periods of time where I felt like I couldn't write. And I make a joke, but it's also the truth, is that I feel that I wouldn't have finished this book without antidepressants, It's not very PC to say, but I often say, well, thank you, Big Pharma, for producing cheap generic antidepressants that I could actually afford that got me through this. I think it's important, again, like people want hope, right? They want the part of the story that they want the happy ending, they want that sort of feeling. And I want to say to folks, yes, there is a whole lot of stuff that we can do to make this better, but it actually needs to be done. And I don't see a whole lot of that actual doing happening out there right now. So there's no point in me, and again, that's the difficult thing. That's where I sort of break the Hollywood narrative. I can't give you a happy ending right now. But I think it's important to be honest about where we are in order to maybe encourage that, because like I say, there are things that we can do, but we really need to revision the entire economy of the dominant sort of economic system of the globe, which, again, in very simple terms, what we're doing right now, what we call economic growth or economic progress, is turning nature into things that are briefly useful to us and that then become pollution and trash. And we do more and more and more of that. And we call that economic growth and economic process. We really, on a very big scale, need to move to truly circular economies. It's a massive job. But I say everything needs to change. But the great thing about everything needs to change is that everybody has something to do in that process. So you can flip the narrative on that into a more sort of, let's say, positive thing, but it actually has to happen. And like I say, I don't see a whole lot of the doing happening. There are certain countries that are doing certain aspects of some of this okay, but hardly anybody has really comprehended the problem well enough and really sat with it long enough, I feel. So yeah, it was incredibly tough psychologically, and I know a lot of people in climate and conservation who go through incredibly difficult psychological experiences, but I don't think there's any getting around that, you know. At some point, we've got to grow up and actually do that. You know, we can't evade it, you know, our whole lives. Or maybe we can, I mean, but I can't. Anything else?
That's it. Thanks so much for wonderful talk and for this enlightening discussion.
Okay.
I think Adam has a couple copies of his
I
book
have
for
a
sale,
handful
maybe?
of copies of my book. If you have Venmo or cash, I can sell you a book for $20 and I'll sign it for you. I think I have
I
four
think
of
you're
them.
doing a signing
Four of
down
them
at
in my suitcase.
Seminary
Yeah,
Co-op this
Seminary
weekend, too.
Bookstore on Saturday at 3 o'clock. I will do a slightly modified version of this talk for a more sort of general public. But then tomorrow, Trevor, perhaps you can tell the folks exactly where it is because I'm not sure of the geography, but we'll be doing a much more freewheeling, into the weeds, maybe academically inclined, quite a different thing to what I've done here today at the University of Chicago. But maybe Trevor, you can tell the folks about that.
Is it on? Yeah, 4:30 in the Heinz building. Everyone is welcome. There'll be a bunch of academics who have been working on climate change. And it'll start with Adam giving a short presentation along these lines, and then his new book. And then we'll basically go into a freewheeling discussion that should end about 6. And then Jacob is organizing a dinner at Siam on 55th Street after that. So you'd be very welcome to join us. And if you need more information, you can always email me, Trevor Price at Chicago.
Yeah, so that'll be dealing a lot with the issue of the sort of conflict between saving species and defossil fueling the economy, because there are real conflicts there that I think need to be explored a lot more robustly than they often are. Yeah, so that could be very interesting.
All right, great. Well, thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.